As I said, I'm Jonathan Bartlett, and I do independent creation and intelligent design research. A lot of it into DNA. What most people don't realize is that since you may have heard that DNA is like the software for your body, and it's largely true. The interesting thing, though, is that a lot of biologists aren't software developers. So being a software developer has given me at least a few insights, I think, into how DNA works, and being a Christian has given me additional ones.
Amen.
So
You can say amen, right?
you can say amen anytime you want. So first, I wanted to do just a real quick on the general subject of science and Christianity. There's a lot of good with people using science to show truths in the Bible, but ultimately Christianity doesn't need science to validate it. But science, one thing most people don't realize is that science does need Christianity for both inspiration and direction, which we'll get into a little bit shortly. Because most advances in science have happened by importing religious ideas into science. There's kind of an idea today that as science expands bigger and bigger, religion kind of gets pushed off into a smaller and smaller corner. And so as science gets bigger, we kind of have to retreat into our little tiny space. But that's not actually the way it works at all. What's been happening is that science, to progress, has been incorporating more and more theology. And so really what's happening is we're relabeling theology as science. And as we do that more and more, if you don't realize that that's what's happening, it looks like we're being pushed into a corner, but actually we're being integrated with the whole.
Which goes in totally in line with the Hogan series, where he calls evolution a religion. He's very specific about that.
So, this is one of my favorite verses. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Now, one thing that a lot of people miss on this is that I think. Oh, sorry, I didn't. I've got my own slides here, so I can see it without looking behind me, and I didn't advance them both at the same time. I got it. Okay, so the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay, so a lot of people, it's not bad to argue to God. Okay, to say God exists because of this, but I would like to make the point that is the beginning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And one of the reasons why Christianity is sometimes maligned as being anti-intellectual or something like that is that we use the fear of the Lord as the end of wisdom. That's as far as it goes. And so one of the things I want to bring out tonight is how knowledge of God can be a starting point for doing additional research and additional and can lead to new and exciting ideas that goes beyond itself. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's where it starts. So I was going to give you just a real quick history of physics and theology. Back in the Greek age, Democritus was the one who kind of came up with the initial ideas about what physics was. And basically the idea is that everything in the world is made of little tiny balls of matter that just bump into each other in different ways. Okay, and he actually called those atoms. He didn't have any conception of the modern atom, but that's what he called them. But basically, everything could only interact by touching. Okay, now that was kind of the idea of the day for physics for hundreds of years. But in Christianity, we don't believe that the only way that two things can interact is by touching. To just begin with, prayer changes things, but not because we're touching anything. You can, and so Isaac Newton brought this into physics. And so if you think of gravity doesn't work by touching. And in fact, they actually called that a spiritual notion, and that was one of the arguments against Newton at the time, was that the idea that two things were interacting without touching was too spiritual of a notion to be included into physics. with Einstein, you may have heard of Einsteinian relativity. What that did, St. Augustine argued that time is a part of creation. Atheists and materialists often think of time as being independent of creation. But Einstein showed and incorporated into physics that time was a part of creation and not independent of it. And then Lemaitre showed that the universe had a beginning. And then in quantum mechanics, we show that the universe is not a machine, that it's not determined what's going to happen. We have at least the potential for free will. And so you can see that each of these major advances in science occur when we incorporate a piece of theology into physics. Now, going on to biology, you have biology actually started by including theology into science. Because by nature, physics doesn't have any conception of purpose about it. You don't say, what is the purpose of that mountain having an avalanche? It's just, we just deal with it in physical terms. But Aristotle developed the science of biology by incorporating purpose into scientific explanation. And so that we understand the way that life works by understanding the purposes. What are the purposes of a rabbit? What are the purposes of life? And the basic purposes to reproduce, to feed, all of those are purpose driven, not mechanism driven. And then Reddy developed experimental biology. And the reason he did it is because at the time they thought that fruit flies came from rotten meat. Or not fruit, I forget what kind of fly it is, but maggots, thank you. Maggots came from rotten meat. And as a believer that God created the original kinds, he said this is not true. And so he devised the first real biology experiment to show that the maggots actually came from outside. He did it by enclosing a piece of meat in a mesh box, and showing that if the meat was enclosed in the mesh box, it did not grow maggots. Maggots grew on the outside when they came and laid their eggs. But the ones that was not enclosed, it laid its eggs and grew in the meat. So then Linnaeus developed the modern system of taxonomy. And the way he did that is by looking at animals' reproductive organs. And see, since God gave the commandment for each thing to create after its kind, the best thing to know to group things together is by their reproductive organs. So those with more compatible reproductive organs are grouped closer together. And that was Linnaeus' system, and it was based on creation. Likewise, Mendel with genetics. A lot of people don't realize that Mendel's idea of genetics came as a criticism of evolutionary theory. Because at the time, the idea was that evolutionary theory, that things would evolve in a gradual fashion towards something else. Well, what Mendel showed is that genes are specific units of features and functionality. And therefore, even though the organism looks like it's gradually moving to different places, there's actually fixed genes that are in the population and that are moving around. So you have each of these major advances in biology happened by applying either general theology or specifically creation to the idea of biology. So it's good to start out, how should we differentiate biology from physics? Well, physics focuses on potentials. If I have a ball up here, what might it do? It might fall, it can be hit, that sort of thing. Biology focuses on purposes. If you think about because you ask questions like, You wouldn't ask in physics, if you have a ball and you drop it down, how fast does it go? You don't say, if you have a ball and drop it down, why did you drop it down? That's not a physics question. But that is a biology question. If you think about your lungs, you have your circulatory system. Well, a standard question is, what is the circulatory system for? And then you say you have a respiratory system. What is the respiratory system for? And so in biology, it's questions of purpose. So physics focuses on configuration. Where is the ball in space? Where will it be 10 minutes from now after I throw it? Biology focuses on design and organization. We don't say, well, which heartbeat is he on and calculate how many heartbeats he's gone. We say, what is the purpose of the heart? How is the heart organized? How is the heart constructed? And so these are all purpose-oriented questions. Now, for the last 100 years or so, biologists have been attempting to remove purpose from biology, but have been horrendously unsuccessful at that, and in fact are moving more toward being more explicit about including purpose. So, all right, so we're going to talk about rethinking biology with created kinds. So, taxonomy. Now, most people think about taxonomy as a really boring subject, but actually, every one of us is wired to do taxonomy. If you think about it, what do kids do when they're out in the grass? They look at the grass. They look at the different kinds of stuff in the grass. They count the number of leaves on something. They count the number of petals. They look at the colors. That's taxonomy. And in fact, they found that there's actually parts of the brain that are specifically wired to do taxonomy in people. So there's a different way of doing taxonomy depending on whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist. So from the evolution standpoint, everything evolved from a common ancestor. The changes were gradual. So as populations evolved, they got more and more distinct from each other. And that's kind of the idea from evolution is that if you all started from a single common ancestor and then they split off into two populations, well, at first the two populations are going to be just the same, okay? But then as they evolve, one population is going to evolve a little differently than this population over here. And so after a while, they'll be different enough to say, well, now instead of being the same species, we'll call them they're different species but the same genus. And then as they evolve more and more and more, say, well, they're now the same family, but they're different genuses. And as they evolve more and more and more, they, we say, well, now they're different families, but the same order. And then as they evolve more, they're different orders, but the same phyla. And then eventually you get into different plant and animal kingdoms. So that is the evolutionary view of taxonomy. It's a simple way to remember it is diversity before disparity. Things get different in small ways, and a lot of getting different in small ways will eventually lead to differences in big ways. Okay? Yes?
Quick thought on the whole, and you're probably going to hit on it later, but I always thought it was, I don't want to say entertaining per se, but to think about things like the gut-filled platypus and sponges and different things that appear to have no connection to any other possible lineage or a mixed bag.
Well,
Are you going to talk about that?
Yeah, I am. The other interesting thing about that is that it occurs first. The first things we see is a gigantic, vast array of organisms. That's the first thing. Even if you take the evolutionary timeline, the first thing you see is a vast array of organisms. So the idea that they just continually diversified in small ways is not supported by any amount of evidence. So then evolutionary taxonomy. Taxonomy is based on natural history rather than type. So they get away that, and not all evolutionary taxonomists do this, but they're all moving in this direction. So they say that the traditional groupings are false, that you should group everything based on what its common ancestors were. So everything that had the same common ancestor should be grouped together. So in that case, we would be fish because we share a common ancestor with fish. And so you actually wind up with this very strange-looking taxonomy. The other interesting thing is that in evolution, the only reality is continuity. That means that everything has to be gradual and in a continuous evolution from something else. Okay, so it's that is the only real part of biology. That any discontinuity you might see, as you're talking about the sponges and whatnot, is just an appearance. It's bad data. So they can only really see continuities. They can't see discontinuities. And then ultimately, taxonomy is accidental. That is, there wasn't a plan behind the taxonomy. That's just how it happened to fall out. So creation operates from a different perspective. In creation, God created multiple distinct kinds of animals. And so by these multiple creation accounts, you actually have disparity before diversity. So you created the big differences before you get the little differences. So if you can imagine Adam and Eve, they had children who were all a little different from their parents, and they had children that were all a little different from their parents. So you start out with humans, dogs, cats, very different from each other. Now within them, as they reproduce, they're going to all get a little bit fuzzier, a little bit more different from each other. So they diversify, but first you start out with the big differences and then get the small differences. So the largest differences between the kinds was there from the start, but each kind can diversify even into multiple species based on the original pattern.
This is interesting too because early on in the course, you guys remember that chart that was split in half and it would show those two principles. I can't think of them all right now, but like the Ten Commandments were diametrically opposed, like each one to when you compare it to an evolution concept, like God creating. Well, I can't think of the example, but there was a chart in the Hovind series where they compared the
Because you have
and different things that happened that were completely opposites. And what you're saying here is another case.
Yeah, it's the same thing in because we're going from different perspectives, from the perspective of accidents bring forth life versus design brings forth life.
Yeah.
And so it's a different way of viewing things. So then taxonomy in creation is based on the order of God's design and God's purposes. So now that doesn't mean that our taxonomy is correct and the taxonomy that we've identified correctly matches God's order and God's design, but that's one of the purposes of science is to continually refine our thoughts so they more closely match the way that God originally designed things. The purpose of physics is to refine our thoughts on the way that matter interacts so that it's closer and closer to the way that God actually designed matter to interact. And likewise, for taxonomy, the goal of taxonomy is to understand the relationships between different species and different organisms so that we understand better God's plan for their relationship. As I mentioned, taxonomy is inherently human drive. And that doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective, but it is part of, if you think about what did God call Adam to do? God called Adam to name the creatures in the garden. That was one of his jobs. So in order to do that, God had to give us the ability to do that. And so you actually find that there is actually a part of the brain that's geared toward that. And think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how similar cats and dogs are? I mean, if you just think about it, you got 4 legs, they're about the same size, they've got head, tail, but all children of nearly nearly every child can distinguish a dog and a cat. And that's because we have this inherent, inborn ability to distinguish what and understand what God has made. So the other important thing is that in creation, we take seriously both the continuities and the discontinuities. So if we find a lot of organisms that share a lot of features and are very close together, we can say, hey, they probably all did evolve from a common ancestor. But then we also take seriously the differences. So when we see large gaps between groups, we say, well, these two groups did not share a common ancestor because we see these consistent gaps and discontinuities. So while as in evolution, only the continuities are taken seriously. In creation, both the continuities and the discontinuities are taken seriously. So what is a created kind anyway? So God created each animal according to its kind. Now that's a very vague phrase. And so in creation biology, we've had to give it a little bit more rigor. Now one of the problems is when God defines something and you attempt to give it rigor, it probably means you're wrong. But it's something that we have to do anyway, just in order to make it a science. So a kind is a set of organisms and species which all descended from one of God's original kinds. So that's kind of how we define it. So the question is, how can you tell if two organisms are of the same created kind? Well, the first one is interbreeding, which the technical term is hybridization. So if you can mate two different species, they are probably the same created kind. So many of you who've seen, I think it's in Napoleon Dynamite, where they've got the ligers and tigons. And, so those are probably the same created kind because you can interbreed them. And so in creation journals, what they do is they'll go through, because there's breeders have made giant lists of different things that you can interbreed. And so they'll go through those lists and connect, say, okay, well, we got this species can breed with this species, and this species can breed with this species. And so that means all three of them are the same created kind. And so that's kind of how it's done. And so by observing these and making long lists of these, you can kind of eventually develop an idea for what a created kind looks like. Another one, although I don't like this one quite as well, is character analysis. And if you basically do a comparison of different species and see, you can statistically see where different traits group together strongly and where traits don't group together strongly. And so you say and this is good, especially if you're doing it on ancient extinct animals. There's a lot of animals we only know from the fossil record. So if we say, well, what created kind were they? Well, we can't interbreed them because they're dead. So what the best we can do is to just look at the general set of characters that we can infer and see what they match with closely. So usually the first starting point of where if you just think, well, what's a good guess for what is a created kind? Well, in taxonomy, you've got the kingdom, animal kingdom, plant kingdom, and you got kingdom, phyla, order, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay, so usually at the family level is usually the best first guess of where the created kinds occur. It kind of goes with our intuitive notions. As I said, God put taxonomy in our minds. And so family is where our definitions actually put the biological relationship, the family. And so you have, for example, Canidae is all dogs, wolves, jackals, those kind of things. And those are all the same created kind. They're all interbreedable. Felidae is all the cats. Tigers, house cats, lions, that sort of thing. So here's some examples. Felidae, Canidae. I put in one Ruminantia, and this is a bit of a stretch, but this includes cattle, giraffes, and deer. A friend of mine is working on doing is one of the. Her name's Jean Leitner, and she does a whole lot of research into this, and she is fairly convinced that all of these animals came from the same created kind. And it's interesting because in the Bible, it puts these guys together. These are the clean animals. Okay. Interestingly, they are identified by having a split hoof and chew the cud, I believe is the biblical reference. And it's strange that those two characteristics exactly define a branch of taxonomy. And they are all separated by having a special stomach that's unlike any other stomach. So you can kind of see the intersection between taxonomy and purpose. Whatever this stomach is doing is a special purpose designed by God, and that purpose is very stable among all the different species, even while with the other attributes of the species being very different. You've got giraffes that are giant and towering and long necks. You've got cattle that are just mooing and deer that are running. And all these different species, but they all share the same purpose with the same structure that God made. And so, and then the Bible actually puts a purpose on that, and that's for being clean animals. Yes?
Okay, just to clarify, I'm used to hearing feline, canine.
Uh-huh.
I may have missed your intro to this slide, but what's the difference between...
Feline is just the adjective.
So it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Plural in Latin.
There you go.
Oh my gosh, she's schooling me here.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Love it. Okay,
So, that's awesome.
that's homeschool.
I homeschool my 3 kids too, so it's awesome. All right, practical applications. So first of all, I believe that there is positive in everything, even in ideas such as evolution. While there isn't evolution from a common ancestor, there is evolution within a created kind. So a practical application of the created kinds is to evolution. And that's to say, what is permanent and what changes? What is part of the design and what evolves? And so this is a good question that creation can ask that evolution is actually incapable of asking. And then my favorite, environmental ecology. So for example, should we, if the last habitat of the wild yellow-toed, orange-hoofed, spotted owl is in your backyard, okay? Should you mow down their last remaining habitat, okay? So now, well, see, the thing is, from an evolutionary standpoint, there's not a difference between any two species. They're all kind of on the same moral and ontological level. In creation, you have the created kind, and then you have these species which have arisen kind of spuriously throughout history. Okay? So in creation, if we can identify what the created kinds are, those are God's designs. Okay? So if there's some species that's well represented with other there's a created kind that's well represented with other species, then it's okay for one specific species to go extinct because we haven't lost God's design. Because that's what we don't want. We don't want to lose God's input on this earth. And so by making sure that we identify correctly and then conserve the created kinds, then we can better do ecology in line with what the world needs. Yes?
Sorry, I keep hogging questions here, but when you brought that up, it made me think of evolution and environmentalism like contradicting one and it seems like, I've always thought they're kind of in it together.
Mhm. Well, the modern environmentalism, the problems from it come from its dependence on evolution. Because if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, there's no better reason to preserve, this little species and that little species and that little species. There's not a fundamental difference between species that are close together and species that are far away. And so that's why they want to preserve every little one.
But according to Jurassic Park,
yes,
life finds a way.
that's true. That's another thing. I went to I've been in classes. I've been in classes like that where it's like, yeah, they try to both say destruction is great, and we have to get rid of this because it's destructive. Yeah. And it's like, well, you can't really have it both ways.
Well, I think it could be argued that the fundamental principle that unites both of them is an anti-human perspective. The idea that in the environment is the ace or the apex of life, and it needs to be preserved at all costs.
Creation is God.
Yes. Evolution is, man is not the apex. Man is just one species amongst a bunch of species and has no unique qualities, no unique values, no unique worth, and thus it should be treated as we would any other species, something that we as humans, note the paradox, should be able to manipulate and do what we want with, which all invariably bleeds over to issues of eugenics, euthanasia, cloning, the manipulation of the human genome, the idea of creating designer babies and those kind of things. And I think that is the underlying principle, is that it's in a sense, it's anti-human.
Mm-hmm. And then you can also use it in farming and other sorts of biological applications where you say, what is the purpose of each of these organisms? Why are they here? Because once we know why something's here, we can make better use of it. We can orient our lives. I mean, one thing that one of the problems that I see with technology is that technology is continually fighting nature. Instead, we need to learn to cooperate with nature. But to learn to cooperate with nature, we have to figure out what God's purpose is with each part. So in summary, and actually I had 3 parts, and this is the summary of the first part, so I think we'll have to stop here. But in summary, creation gives us a bigger tool set. It allows us to see both continuity and discontinuity as real. It allows us to look beyond natural history into design and purpose, and it flows in continuity with human intuition. We don't have to chuck our intuitions when we go into science. We can bring them with us and use it to sharpen and focus. Not only should intuition should sharpen our science, and science should sharpen our intuitions.
Well, as I set up our brief discussion time tonight, when Jonathan and I first spoke, I said, I know you can talk about everything all night, but what are your 2 main strengths? And he said DNA and image of God. Those 2 things are really can go all day about. And so this is a great setup for us and everything, but I wanted to let you all know what he enjoys talking about, other than entertaining any of your questions that may have popped in your head tonight. I know I've got a couple if I get crickets in here. But anyway, I'd just like to open it up to you guys. And I will add to say that as I presented this class from the beginning, it was very important to me, and I think many of the people in the class that were interested, is what is our response to society these days? As you so greatly illustrated walking over there, feeling cornered, the Christian response, practical tools, how we can, clearly it's a lightning rod subject anywhere you go, but how can we make a difference and influence our community? That's kind of the purpose of our class anyway.
Mm-hmm. One of the things along those lines is, I've long felt that one of the things, it's good to argue the points in favor of creation, but it's also good to argue how you can use creation to better understand the world. Because, especially if you speak with people of a scientific mind, they're usually very practical. They want to know how this works. How does this make our lives better? They're usually in technology. And so the idea is, what is it about, if you're going to argue creation, you've got to tell them how the idea of creation will help life get better. And so simply arguing that it's true, we live in a culture where just being true is not enough. It's not enough for it to be true. It has to be practical. And so that's one of the things why I oriented toward some of the practical uses, because that is the sort of thing that our culture needs to understand that something's true.
All right.
Question?
What was ours?
You say you do a lot of talking about DNA
Mhm.
and genetics and stuff. Do you do anything that talks about like the genetic modifications of crops and things like that now?
I have not done a lot on what I really don't know very much on what we've done as far as genetic modification. I actually know one of the guys who started it. He's actually now a creationist. But I don't know a lot about the effects or I'm a little skeptical of it, both for two reasons. One is that it looks like people are trying to override God's purposes with their own. And if you look at the allergies that are happening today, most of them are from the same things that we're genetically modifying. My wife has corn and wheat allergies, and that's where most of the genetic modification comes from. So, I'll give you a real quick summary rather than going. I actually have a whole DNA presentation planned. I'll give you a quick 5-minute summary. DNA. Most people think about evolution when they think about DNA, they think about mutations. All right, and when we think about mutations, what's a word that comes in your mind if you think about mutation?
X-Men.
X-Men. All right. Are mutations planned? Actually, they are. That's the thing. But yes, that's the first thing that comes into people's mind is when they hear mutation, they think random mutation. Okay, because that's the idea that's been fronted, and that is that's almost wholly wrong. Not entirely wrong. I've had 2 children with genetic diseases, so I know that there are in fact diseases that are genetic, but when we first discovered bacteria, bacteria was thought to be entirely bad, because we discover things when they go wrong. That's how we discover things, especially in medicine. We discover them when they go wrong. We discovered bacteria when they induce disease, and so for a long time we thought that bacteria equals germs. So any bacteria is germs and we should get away from it and they're bad. But it turns out we actually have more bacteria cells in our body than regular cells. So it's not that bacteria is bad, it's just that we know some bad bacteria that exists. And so like the same way, when we first discovered mutations, we discovered them because they were bad. And so we came up with this idea that all mutations are bad and haphazard. But what we've been finding the last couple decades is that your body has amazing systems for generating mutations. For example, first of all, in your body, so the way that your immune system works is that when a foreign object or bacteria come in, that's called an antigen. And your body generates antibodies to the antigen. And the antibody comes and sticks to the antigen, and one side sticks to the antigen, and the other side signals the immune system that says, hey, come and get me. All right? And so what happens is there's actually, you have millions of different antibodies, but you don't have millions of different genes. So the way that works is there's actually your body has a set of buckets of parts. And the way that when your immune cells mature, they take a piece from each bucket and create a new gene. It's kind of like interchangeable parts, but they're all different. Or like the rail mounting system on a gun. You can add sights. You can add a 203 grenade launcher. You can add other stuff. It's parts. And so by having these different parts, you can actually from about 200 genes, you can make a few million antibodies by recombining the parts. Okay. Not only that, when you get an infection, if it's by something that you don't have a match for, your body actually mutates the antibody gene. Okay. So your genome is 3 billion base pairs long. Okay. Your antibody gene is 1,200 base pairs long. Okay. When this is happening, all of the mutations happen in the antibody gene. Not only that, there's two halves of the antibody gene. One part sticks to the antigen. The other part signals the immune system. All of the mutations happen in the part that stick to the antigen, because it wouldn't help if you had mutations in the part that signaled the immune system, because your immune system isn't changing. And so out of 3 billion base pairs, your body finds the right 600 that it needs to mutate and puts all the mutations there. And so anyway, so the idea that mutations are accidental are from, first of all, the history of it, because that's how we find things in biology, is by finding them going wrong. But also because of evolution, because evolution says that there can't be a plan to how life unfolds. But if you believe that, if you see that there is a plan for how mutations are happening, you can see that God has a plan for how life unfolds. So anyway.
So last week, I know you weren't here,
Okay.
but one of the people that was quoted said that originally they felt the fundamental principles were energy and matter.
Mm-hmm.
But with the discovery of being able to look down to our cells and DNA and all this kind of stuff, they've added a new fundamental principle, and that is information.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the concept of information impact
So
this discussion? Because you were discussing, the antigens
Mhm.
goes and picks out the 600 need to be to
Right.
defeat this whatever the defeat the antibody. I'm getting the word
Yeah.
wrong, but
Mhm.
so go ahead.
Yeah. So the question is how does information play into this? There are some people who say that evolution cannot create new information, and that's somewhat true. It is, but as I showed in the when it's creating a new antibody, it can kind of create something new by picking out new parts from the parts list. There are bacteria who have backup genes, like 12 backup genes for what they put on their surface, and so if they want to hide, they'll switch out a part from one of those backup genes to their outer coat genes. And so you can actually have something that's generally never been seen before, but it was also there already, because the information to pull that out was already there. And so you can see that what I like to say is that it may or may not be the case that information is not created, but anytime information is created, it's always from having a lot more information already there. That it takes information in order to build information. And so in order to pull these parts out, it had to have the information on where the parts are, what the parts can be used for, how the parts are separated. Because they're separated in the genome because it's just one long string of letters. So what it has is it has sequences that say, here's where you cut. And this sequence says cut here. This sequence says cut here. This sequence says use this for the front, use this for the middle, use this for the back. And so there's a whole lot of information that goes into constructing that gene, even though the gene might be brand new. There's a lot of information that goes into it.
But doesn't that still just show you just a deeper level of predetermination?
Yeah, it's a deeper level of information. So, the problem comes in that it's hard to quantify information. So if if you were to say there's no new information, someone will say, okay, we'll measure the information and let's find out.
So they want proof.
Right. And so if you were to say that there's no new information, then the burden of proof lies on you to calculate how much information there was before, how much information there was after, and show that there wasn't any increase.
So, but the whole reason for that line of thought is because we as creationists would say information implies creation.
Yeah.
Because you can't. Okay, computer's got tons of information, but how did it get there? Some person put it there.
Right.
And if our body has a basic information source,
Mm-hmm.
then how did it get there? It had to be put there we would say by the designer, by God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but you're saying, but the evolutionist counterpoint to that is, well, we don't know that new information. How do you know that there's not new information? The new information didn't itself evolve.
Yeah. How did you compute that?
Right. How do you compute that information itself?
Right. So what I can point to is that every time where someone thinks that new information came about, we can also always show that there was information there guiding that.
Based on the fact that we've invented computers, but we didn't invent computers out of nothing.
Right.
We invented computers out of electricity technology that developed, out of, lightning bolts that come from nature. It doesn't just come from nowhere.
Right.
So that's the counter argument for creationism.
Mm-hmm.
That even though it looks like this is new information, it's based on something else.
Yeah, and
it was already existing.
Yeah, and it all requires other things to be there. Actually, what you can measure is you can measure the likelihood that something will be a beneficial mutation compared to a random mutation. And so you can and so, like, for example, in the case of the in the case of the antibody mutating to get the right combination to attach to the antigen, there is you get when you reduce from mutating across the entire genome to mutating those 600 base pairs, you are increasing the likelihood of success by 22 orders of magnitude. Okay, and usually in science, 3 or 4 orders of magnitude is pretty good. And so here you're saying that there is enough information in the genome to increase the likelihood of a good hit by 22 orders of magnitude. And so anyway, so that's the way, and that's actually one of the methods that I've been helping to develop is how to quantify that. So.
I'm ready for a lightning rod question here. Right. Now, DNA. I want to set this up because I know of time. We understand homosexuality is a big topic of the day. I think most of us in the room are conservative in that area and understand the natural order of male-female.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard studies in small populations of certain animals that
Mm-hmm.
have seen some random same-sex activity,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing in the natural order shows that kind of behavior really. And other than just procreation,
Mm-hmm.
is there what is not being heard in the public arena
Mm-hmm.
about genetics and natural order about homosexuality?
So
Remember the kids in the room.
there's a few things on homosexuality. First of all, I don't claim to know whether or not there is a genetic basis or not. I tend to think there's not, but I don't really care because there's also genetic basis to drinking and a whole lot of other things. The fact that there's a genetic, something that triggers a genetic propensity doesn't make it right, because we are all born into sin. And if we were to take the line that things that we're naturally predisposed to are inherently good, then we'd have to toss most of the Bible out the door, because we're not predisposed all to do good. But I think most of the studies on that are pretty questionable, though. Now, as far as the natural order, I also say, creation itself is also fallen. Okay, so we should not look to nature as being a solid, perfect working out of God's will right now. And then third, we also shouldn't look to nature as being necessarily exactly reflective of how humans should work. The homosexual relationships in the animal kingdom are pretty small, but they are there. But there's also a lot in the animal kingdom where there's what we would consider philandering. There's eating their children. There's eating their mates, and we don't show a high view of eating your mates.
We don't think that's something we should import at this time.
Exactly.
We don't think that's something we should import into the human
Yes.
at this time.
Yes.
Might come later.
Now, but biblically, the Bible makes it very clear what the importance of marriage is, and this is one thing that most people miss. The Bible says, therefore, let's see if I can get this right. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother to be joined to his wife. Okay, what happened before the therefore? One principle of interpretation someone taught me once a long time ago was that anytime you see the word therefore, you should see what it's there for. And so basically, when you see a therefore, you should back up and see what it's there for. And if you actually see it, this is immediately after God created woman out of Adam. And so what it is it shows that God created two halves of humanity to be joined together. And that the therefore says that because God created woman separately from man, therefore they should be joined together to be whole. And so homosexual relationships deny that there is that there's anything missing from males or anything missing from females. It's a denial of that, and actually that's right before God made woman out of man. Right before that, man said that it said that there was not a suitable partner found for him, and so there is something missing in males, and there is something missing in females, and so marriage is the celebration of filling that, of fixing that, and bringing humanity together permanently. And so that's kind of where I stand on gay marriage. So.
Well, we've gone past time. Did you take the challenge here, folks? Sorry about that. We went a little bit over, but I know.
All right. Well, thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys.